Today I'm going to tell you about WebGL with THREE.js. And this talk is going to be a little bit different than the ones that you've seen before because I'm going to have less slides and a demo. But first, one thing I would like to talk about, which is funny that Israel also mentioned it in his talk, is birds. So one of my big inspirations when I started WebGL 4 years ago was when I got home from work in my hometown, which is quite a lot smaller than Eindhoven here. I always cycled home. And what I saw in the nature around me was the big thousands of birds that were flying in a system that we don't understand, but all in this specific flow that was really amazing to see. And it's something that I used for my WebGL experiments that I did over the last years. So with a lot of little particles that move in specific ways that you can make with math. So that's also something I'm going to show today. Whoops. So who am I at first? I'm a creative developer at DPDK. And a creative developer for us means that basically, of course, every developer is creative. But what it means for us is that I do front-end development. And I also take a part in WebGL. So we did a lot of campaigns for big clients where we made like 3D models, we made animations that are all based on WebGL. And it's all very experimental, so it can go wrong, but it can also look very, very nice. In my spare time, I also experiment a lot with WebGL to really understand it. I made Phenomenon, which is a library that's super small, that's just the basics of core WebGL, to give me a better understanding of what actually THREE.js itself is. And I also did a lot of experiments on CodePen and CodeDrop, so if you ever want to check those out, feel free. But today I'm going to talk about THREE.js. And THREE.js is a library that has so many things that you're going to need in WebGL that are basically the foundation of every experiment I ever made. So they have basic shapes, lights, colors, everything you're going to need in an experiment. So today, I'm going to tell you how you can go from one single box, and you'll know what I mean with just a simple box, to 1,000 that are going to animate. So what you see here is the steps that we are going to go over. I'm not actually going to show you the code itself. You, of course, can find it on the URL I'm going to share. But I don't know, who has experience with WebGL right now? Cool. So the first thing that's always important for every project, regardless of if you use WebGL, is set up a proper base. So this step-by-step guide is basically how I set up my base for every single experiment that I make. So the first thing is a native API that we can use, which is called request animation frame. And what this does, it gives you a callback for every single frame that's rendered by the browser. So 60 frames per second on most computers or on our smartphones. It gives you a callback where you can do stuff, for example, the animation that you're going to do. You can do it based on frames or time. And then in that specific function, you can just update the steps. And once we have that set up, the first thing we are going to do is we're going to add a mesh. And a mesh is simply something that you can see, something physical that you can move. For example, this bottle. This bottle has a shape, but it also has a material. So the one is the geometry, and the one is the material, and that's going to define how it looks. And once you have that properly set up, basically everything you do after that step is going to look nice. So one thing that's, when I got asked to do this talk, I was working on my own WebGL implementation, and then the makers of THREE.js, they announced instant mesh. And what this is basically, normally if you were to render 1,000 cubes, your whole laptop is just going to stutter and it's not going to be good looking. But what instant mesh does is basically you can combine 1,000 cubes and handle it like it's a single cube. So everything is just rendered in a single frame instead of 1,000. So that's very nice. And once those steps are done, we can start the actual transition of cubes, other shapes, and then tweak on the lights. And of course, something I like to add to every single experiment that I do is rainbow colors, because why not, right? So I also, before like this talk, I think like 2 weeks ago, I was working to get out as many examples as I could for this talk. And in the end, I was like, yeah, this is not going to work, because once I was at the 5th experiment, I found issues that I needed to fix in all of the 4 before. So in the end, I just created one that has like a lot of options. So these are all created in, like I said, if the base is good, then you can create these real fast. So these are probably made in like 1 minute. So right now, whoops. How can I go out of this? Fuck. How do I get out of this? That's it. Okay, so this is basically the experiment that I made. And what you see here is geometry that moves over a line. And what you can see, you can control this, and you can give a wide variety of options to these blocks, basically, that are moving on a line. And what I did also in the train this morning to this conference is I added some more presets. And when I click through these, you need to know that all of these are based on the same principle. The only thing that I'm changing is values, and they're all still animating over a single line. So for example, if I click on some of these, you can see, like, it looks like these are moving in the system, but it's still on a single line. I'm going to click through these a bit. And what you can see here as well is that I can tweak the colors for every single experiment that I do, and the shape as well. And the most basic one that I made was this one. And here you can clearly see how the geometry that I create is animating over a single line. So if I were to tweak this value, you could see there that there's actually one single cube moving over this line right now. And what I can do then is I can add more cubes, and I can tell the script that it should be using more of that line. So for example, I can make it bigger and bigger and bigger. And now you can see that it's occupying more of that simple line. Also, things that I can do now, because it's all based on the same system, is just tweak some values. So for example, I can change the colors of this. I can change the count. And I can make them move from their base. So what I try to do here is basically I get a proper base where shapes can animate over a single line. And once that was done, I could just create these presets based on the options that you see here. And then it just works. And for this one specifically, I found this one just by tweaking some of the parameters. It's really odd to see this as moving over a single line. But once I turn this one on, you can see that it's actually, they're all animating over that single line. So when I tweak these, they will just go in different shapes in different order. So yeah, I'm not sure if I had shown you all of these. Yeah, so right now for every single one, you can see that they are, if I turn the size down a little, you can see they're all still moving over that same line. Of course, this one. And once that was done, I kept adding more features, for example, the depth, so they can move over more, bigger space, as well as the shape they can take. So, for example, they still do the same thing, but I can just tweak the shape to be whatever I want them to be. And then, of course, tweak some other stuff. So these are just flying donuts in rainbow colors. But like you see, I just tweaked some variables, and right now it just turned from a plus with some blocks to flying donuts with rainbow colors. So yeah, this is what I like to do for a lot of my experiments. I like to create one single setup, and once that's done, I like to add some parameters which people can play with and then make their own. So one thing I did here, instead of like making the 10 or the 20 demos that I started out to do, I instead made one, which has like a lot of options. So my biggest learning from this, and also like the other applications and the normal websites I make, is if you have a solid base structure, you're like 80% of the way there. And this also accounts for other things. So for example, the whole setup of the website that I make, the system that I made here, once we have that 80%, once we have the base setup where things can move over a line, the only thing we need to tweak is the shape, the color, the lighting, the shadows. And even before this conference started this morning, I had in mind that I still needed to update this example, because yesterday, the day before, I still added more options. I added different shapes. I added the rainbow colors that can be randomly adjusted. And I'm still going to work on this because I see that there's a lot more potential to this. For example, you can change lighting, you can change effect, you can change the material of elements to be realistic. You can make them sparkle lights, whatever. So right now I have this base setup, and the other 20% is still on my list. So that's why I decided to create a structure that allows many different outcomes to be made just by adjusting some values. So if you want to see this is actually available on a link right now. It's called exploringwebgl.app. It was just a domain that I still had laying around, which is relevant for WebGL. And also something that I would like to, if you have time, of course, that you can do is if you go to this website, you can tweak the parameters of it. And there's a little create option in the options tab. And if you create it, the whole thing will be exported into the URL. So if you have that URL, you can send it to your friends or to me, and I might add it in the official thing. And of course, then we can just click through and see all the different creations that people like. If you want even more of that, THREE.js, of course, the library that I use for this, provides a lot of examples, also with very realistic models, very minimalistic models, but also big particle clouds like you see over there, to like smaller animations. So I highly recommend, if you're into WebGL or like creative visuals like this, to check this one out. And that's it. Thank you.